My name is Renata Calloway, and I want to tell you the story of the worst and best week of my life because I think you need to hear it, and because if I don't write it down somewhere, I might convince myself it never happened the way it did. I might soften the edges, smooth over the parts that embarrassed me, sand down the moments where I sat on the floor of my kitchen and cried so hard I couldn't breathe. I don't want to do that. I want to tell you everything, exactly as it happened, from the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always matters. You can't understand how extraordinary the ending was without knowing how completely, utterly destroyed the middle felt. So let me start where it really started. Not the day Marcus drained my accounts, not the morning I woke up and checked my phone and felt the world tilt sideways off its axis, but further back. Much further back to when Marcus and I were kids sharing a bathroom in a 3-bedroom house in Tucson, Arizona, and he used to steal the last of my cereal and then deny it with milk still on his chin. That was Marcus. That was always Marcus. Charming, impossible, infuriating mine. He was 3 years younger than me, which meant that for most of my childhood, I was simultaneously his protector and his victim. He would follow me around the house, borrowing my things without asking, eating my snacks, reading my diary once, which I never fully forgave him for, though I told him I did. And then when the neighborhood kids tried to bully me in 7th grade, it was Marcus who showed up at the school bus stop and stood between me and Tyler Hendricks with his little fists balled up, all 90 pounds of him, and said something so unexpectedly sharp and funny that Tyler laughed and walked away and never bothered me again. That was also Marcus. He contained multitudes. Our mother used to say that Marcus had been born with a gift for finding exactly the line between charming and infuriating, and that his lifelong project was to walk that line as boldly as possible. She said it with exasperation but also with love, because it was impossible not to love Marcus. It was impossible not to be drawn to him. He walked into rooms and they shifted around him. He laughed and you laughed too before you even understood why. He made promises he didn't always keep, but he made them so beautifully that the keeping almost didn't matter. At least, not in the moment. At least, not until it did. I left Tucson at 18 for college in Portland, and Marcus stayed home for a couple of years, then drifted to various cities: Austin, Nashville, Denver, briefly Los Angeles, doing various things that he described grandly and vaguely. He sold cars for a while. He worked at a recording studio. He managed a bar. He got a real estate license and used it exactly once. He started a podcast about true crime that got decent numbers for about 4 months before he got bored and stopped releasing episodes. He always had a plan. He always had a story. He always had a reason why the last thing hadn't worked out and why the next thing was going to be different. And I always believed him, or tried to, because he was my brother and I loved him. And also because there were enough times when things did work out, briefly, brilliantly, in ways that seemed to justify all the chaos leading up to them, that I kept resetting my expectations and hoping. My daughter Lily was born when I was 28, after a marriage that lasted 3 years and ended with enough sadness and enough mutual agreement that there was no real villain in the story, just two people who had grown in different directions and decided it was better to part kindly than to stay and grow resentful. Lily's father, Daniel, moved to Seattle, and we maintained a civil, occasionally warm, co-parenting relationship. Lily went to him on holidays and alternate summers and called him on Sundays. She was 10 when all of this happened, which means she had been alive long enough to understand things that 10-year-olds aren't supposed to have to understand, but not quite long enough to know how to pretend she didn't understand them. That directness, that clear-eyed honesty, was the thing that saved me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. By the time I was 38, I had built something I was genuinely proud of. I had a small house in Portland that I owned, that I had worked very hard to be able to afford, that had a garden in the back where Lily grew tomatoes every summer, and where I grew herbs I mostly forgot to use. I had a job I liked, managing operations for a mid-sized tech company, which paid well and gave me enough flexibility to be present for Lily while still challenging me in the ways I needed to be challenged. I had savings. Real savings, the kind that represented years of disciplined choices, of saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to security. I had a retirement account, an emergency fund, a college savings account for Lily that I had been contributing to since she was born. I had worked very hard to become someone who was financially stable because I had watched my parents struggle with money in ways that left marks, and I had decided early on that I would not let that happen to me. It had not been easy. It had required the kind of sustained effort and attention that doesn't make for exciting stories, but makes for a life you can actually live without constant dread. I was proud of that. I want to be honest about that, because it's part of why what Marcus did hurt as much as it did. It wasn't just the money. It was the years behind the money. It was the discipline and the sacrifice and the choices, all of it undone in what I would later learn was the span of about 40 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Marcus had come to stay with me 6 weeks before it happened. He called from Denver, which was his most recent city, and said he was having a rough patch. He sounded genuinely low, genuinely beaten, in a way that I hadn't heard from him in years, maybe ever. He said things weren't working out, that he'd been struggling, that he just needed somewhere to land for a while, to regroup. He didn't give me specifics and I didn't push for them, because Marcus never gave specifics when he was vulnerable, and pushing for them had always made him defensive and distant. I told him he could come. Of course I told him he could come. He was my brother. He sounded like he was drowning. You throw a rope to someone who is drowning. That is not a complicated decision. He arrived on a Saturday morning with 2 duffel bags and a guitar he no longer played, and that same grin, somewhat dimmed but still there, still capable of making me feel like the sun had come out. Lily liked him immediately. She always had. Marcus had a quality with children that was rare. He took them seriously without condescending to them. He asked Lily real questions and listened to her real answers. He helped her with a school project about ocean ecosystems and stayed up until 11 at night cutting out pictures of anglerfish with her while I slept. He cooked dinner twice a week, and they were good dinners. Not elaborate, but thoughtful. The kind that showed he had actually considered what people wanted to eat. He fixed the leaky faucet in the hallway bathroom without being asked. He was, those first few weeks, a version of himself I hadn't seen in a long time, and I let myself believe maybe this was the reset. Maybe this time the rough patch had shaken something loose in him, knocked him into alignment in some important way. I want to tell you that there were obvious signs I missed. I want to give you a list of red flags I ignored so you can feel righteous about what I should have done differently. But the honest truth is there wasn't a list. There were small things, things that in retrospect have arranged themselves into a pattern, but at the time each seemed individually explainable. He borrowed my car a few times and came back late, but he had apologized and explained, and the explanations were reasonable. He had long phone calls he took in the backyard, but adults have private phone calls. He asked me once, casually, about my banking app, whether I used the same bank for everything, and I said yes and showed him how I had it set up on my phone because he said he was thinking of switching banks and wanted to see the interface, and I didn't think twice about it, not once. Why would I? He was my brother. He was staying in my house. He was helping Lily with her homework and fixing my faucet. He was my brother. The week before it happened, a woman started texting him constantly. I noticed it only because the notification sound became almost rhythmic, a background music to our evenings. I didn't ask, because Marcus's romantic life had always been complicated, and I had learned long ago not to insert myself into it unless asked. He mentioned her name once, in passing, said her name was Deja, said she was someone he'd known in Denver, said it lightly, the way you mention a weather forecast. I didn't ask follow-up questions. That Thursday, he told me he was going to meet up with a friend and might be late. He kissed Lily on the top of the head the way he always did, said goodnight to me, took his jacket off the hook by the door. I watched him go. I made Lily's lunch for the next day. I went to bed. I woke up Friday morning to 17 notifications on my phone. That sounds dramatic, but it's precisely what happened. My phone was face down on the nightstand, and when I flipped it over, the screen was full. Transaction alerts, from my bank, from both my banks, from all 3 accounts I had linked to my banking app. I sat up in bed, and the room did something strange, went briefly flat, like a photograph of itself. I opened the app with hands that were already shaking before I had consciously registered why. The checking accounts, drained. every dollar withdrawn in 3 transactions the night before between 9:15 and 9:52 p.m. The savings account drained. Not quite every dollar. There was $11.40 remaining, which felt like a cruelty, like he had wanted to leave just enough that I couldn't say it was empty, just enough to remind me what had been there. The college savings account for Lily drained. Every single cent of the $23,000 I had been putting away since she was an infant. The money earmarked for her future, her education, her choices, gone. The total was just over $62,000. 62,000 and some hundreds. The sum of years. I sat in my bed with my phone in my hands and I did not move for what was probably 3 minutes, but felt like something outside of time. Then I called Marcus. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I texted him. I texted him 5 times. I called again. I texted, Marcus, call me right now. I texted, where are you? I texted, what did you do? Nothing. The phone sat in my hand and said nothing back, and I understood, in the slow, horrible way that you understand things your brain is trying to protect you from, that the nothing was its own answer. I got up. I went downstairs. I made coffee because my body needed something to do while my mind was trying to process the unprocessable. I stood at the kitchen counter and drank half a cup of coffee and thought about my savings account, about the specific morning 7 years ago when I had transferred $1,000 into it and thought, this is the beginning of something real. About the automatic transfers I set up and never touched. About the way I had felt, a complicated private pride, when the balance hit $50,000 for the first time. I thought about Lily's college fund, about all the years of birthday money and tax returns and careful choices. I thought about Marcus at the front door, kissing Lily on the head, taking his jacket. I put my coffee cup in the sink and I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that Lily came downstairs in her pajamas looking for breakfast and found me. She was 10 years old, in Snoopy pajamas with her hair in 2 messy braids from the day before, and she looked at me on the floor and she said very calmly, Mom, what happened? I tried to tell her in a way that was honest but not terrifying. I told her that Uncle Marcus had done something he shouldn't have done, that he had taken money from our accounts and left. I told her I didn't know where he was. I watched her face process this, watched the specific way children process betrayal when the betrayer is someone they love, that particular stillness, that interior rearranging. She sat down on the floor next to me. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, all of it? And I said yes. She said, even my college money? And I said yes. And she was quiet again. And then she leaned her head against my arm and we sat on the kitchen floor together for a while, and neither of us said anything. Later that morning, I went to the bank. I filed a police report. I called the bank's fraud department and spent 2 hours on the phone being transferred between departments, while a customer service representative explained to me very patiently that because Marcus had used credentials that had been shared with him, the situation was complicated from a fraud standpoint, that it would require an investigation, that these things took time, that there were no guarantees. I said I understood. I did not understand. I went through the motions of understanding because the alternative was to scream into the phone. And I had Lily in the back seat of the car and she was watching me with those clear, careful eyes, and I did not want her to see me scream. I called my mother. That was one of the harder calls. My mother had always managed to love Marcus and worry about Marcus simultaneously, the way you do with the children who are most like you in the ways you least want to admit. She cried. She apologized as though she had done it personally, which was a kind of guilt by association that I recognized and couldn't talk her out of. She said she would try to reach him. She said she was so sorry. She said she had warned him, which wasn't something I needed to hear right then, but which I understood was her way of trying to separate herself from what he had done. I called my best friend Corinne, who came over that evening with wine and groceries and the specific fury of someone who had never fully trusted Marcus to begin with and was now completely justified in that distrust. Corinne had always been politely skeptical of Marcus, the kind of skepticism she mostly kept to herself out of respect for my feelings. Now she sat at my kitchen table and her eyes were bright with righteous anger, and she held my hand and said, "We are going to figure this out," with such certainty that I almost believed her. The evening was hard. Getting Lily to bed was hard. I sat on the edge of her bed, and she asked me questions that children ask when they are trying to understand adult wrongdoing. Did Uncle Marcus know it was wrong? Was he going to go to jail? Were we going to be okay? I answered as honestly as I could. Yes, he knew. I don't know about jail. Yes, we're going to be okay. That last one I said with more confidence than I felt, but saying it out loud helped. That's one of the strange gifts of having a child. You are required to be brave enough to comfort them, and sometimes the performance of bravery becomes actual bravery without you noticing the transition. I kissed her forehead. I turned off the light. She said from the darkness, "Mom, I took care of it." I stopped in the doorway. I turned around. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I said. "I took care of it," she said again. "You'll see." Her voice was sleepy and completely certain. I stood in the doorway for a moment, not knowing what to say to that. I thought, probably, that she was half asleep and saying something that made sense in dream logic but not waking logic. I thought she might mean something symbolic, some gesture of solidarity she had made that I wasn't aware of. I said, "Okay, baby, go to sleep." I closed her door. I went back downstairs and I sat at the kitchen table and I tried to make a plan, because that is what I do when I am terrified. I make lists, I outline steps, I impose structure on chaos. I wrote down what I knew. I wrote down what I needed to do. I wrote down who I needed to call. I looked at the numbers on the screen of my laptop and tried to calculate how long we could manage on my salary alone, without savings, given our expenses. It was survivable. That was the word that kept coming to me. Survivable, not comfortable, not easy, not anything close to what we'd had, but survivable. I went to bed at 2 in the morning. The next day was Saturday. Lily woke up before me and I could hear her downstairs, and I thought, again, about what she had said the night before. I took care of it. I brushed my teeth and went downstairs, and she was at the kitchen table with her laptop, the one she used for school, the lid covered in stickers of planets and frogs, and a single holographic unicorn. She looked up when I came in, and her expression was one I hadn't seen on her face before, or not quite like that. A mixture of nerves and excitement and something older, something that didn't quite belong to a 10-year-old face. "Mom," she said, "sit down, I need to show you something." I sat down. She turned the laptop to face me. On the screen was a TikTok account. The username was Lily Fights Back, and it had been created 48 hours ago, which was, I would later understand, sometime during the night when I thought she was sleeping. The account had 11 videos. Each one was Lily, sitting at the kitchen table or standing in the backyard, speaking directly to the camera in a clear, measured voice. She had used the ring light from her art kit, the little one she used for painting videos. She was wearing the green cardigan she wore when she wanted to look serious. In the first video, which was 1 minute and 42 seconds long, she explained what had happened. She said, "Hi, I'm Lily. I'm 10 years old and I live in Portland with my mom. 3 days ago, my uncle stole $62,000 from my mom's bank accounts and disappeared. This is his picture." She held up a printed photograph of Marcus, one from Christmas 2 years ago, where he was smiling broadly in a red sweater. "His name is Marcus Calloway. He used to live in Denver, but he left. If you know where he is, please tell someone. But also, my mom worked really hard for that money and I want to help her, so I'm asking for help." I stared at the screen. I looked up at Lily. She was watching me with those nervous, excited eyes biting her bottom lip. "Lily?" I said. "When did you do this?" "Thursday night," she said. "After you went to sleep? I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what he did." "You made these videos at night?" "I made the first 3 at night. Then I made more on Friday while you were at the bank. Mrs. Patterson was here, remember? You asked her to come over. I said I was doing homework. Mrs. Patterson was our neighbor, 72 years old, who sometimes stayed with Lily when I needed cover. You lied to Mrs. Patterson?" "I said I was working on a project," Lily said, "which is technically true." I looked at the screen again. The first video had 412,000 views. I read that number 3 times, 412,000. The comments numbered in the tens of thousands. I scrolled. People were expressing outrage, support, offers to help. There were people saying they recognized Marcus from the photo. There were people sharing the video. There were news accounts, I realized, actual local news accounts that had commented. "Lily," I said, and my voice was not entirely steady. "This has gone viral." "I know," she said. She paused. "Is that okay?" I looked at her. My daughter, 10 years old, in her green cardigan, who had seen her mother on the kitchen floor and decided that sitting on the floor and waiting was not acceptable, that something needed to be done, and had done it with the tools available to her with a clarity and a directness that I, twice her age, had not been able to manage in the days since. "Baby," I said, and I started crying, which I had been trying not to do in front of her for 2 days. "Come here." She came around the table and I hugged her, this fierce little person, and she patted my back with her small hands. She said, into my shoulder, "I also put a GoFundMe link in the bio. I asked Corinne's daughter to help me set it up because she's in college and knows about that stuff. Is that okay?" I pulled back and looked at her. "You called Maya?" "I texted her. She said it was okay. She helped me make it professional." I looked at the screen again. There was a GoFundMe link pinned to the top of the comments on the most popular video. The goal was $65,000. There was a current total. I looked at the current total. I read it 3 times, the way I had read the 400,000 views. The current total was $41,200 in 48 hours. $41,000 from strangers on the internet who had watched a 10-year-old girl in a green cardigan explain that her uncle had stolen her mother's savings. I put my hand over my mouth. Lily watched me. "Mom," she said, very seriously, "are you okay?" I started laughing. It came out mixed with crying in a way that probably looked alarming, but Lily recognized it for what it was. Relief, disbelief, gratitude, love. And she smiled. That particular smile she had where one side went up a little faster than the other. Her father's smile, and said, "I told you, I took care of it." I spent the next hour looking at everything she had built in those 2 days. The 11 videos, each one clear and factual and specific, avoiding melodrama while being completely honest. She had told the story of how Marcus came to stay with us, how he had seemed to be doing better, how he had left. She had explained what the money represented, not just the amounts, but what they were for, the college fund, the emergency fund, the savings she'd watched me work toward her whole life. She had been careful not to be cruel about Marcus, had said in one video. "I don't want him to be in trouble. I just want my mom's money back, and I want people to know what he did." She had answered questions in the comments with the patience of someone twice her age. She had pinned a comment with the GoFundMe information and updated the total every few hours. She had, in 48 hours, largely without my knowledge, conducted a media campaign of such precision and emotional intelligence that it had reached hundreds of thousands of people and moved them to action. She was 10. She was in Snoopy pajamas. She had a holographic unicorn sticker on her laptop. I did not know whether to be awed or terrified, and I chose awed because Lily deserved to be seen clearly for what she had done, and what she had done was extraordinary. The news coverage started that afternoon. A local Portland station had reached out through the TikTok comments, and Lily had taken a screenshot and shown it to me with immense self-control, because she understood that this was now a family decision, and not just hers alone, which showed, I think, an awareness of limits that was as impressive as everything else about what she had done. I called the station back. They came on Sunday morning, a young reporter named Grace Abernathy, who arrived with a cameraman and sat across from me at the kitchen table, while Lily sat next to me with her hands folded, answering questions with the composure of someone who had clearly thought through what she wanted to say. The story aired on the Sunday evening news. By Monday morning, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. The GoFundMe passed $60,000 on Monday afternoon. It passed the goal while I was on a call with my bank's fraud department, who informed me that given the circumstances and the supporting documentation I had provided, they were launching an expedited investigation, and that preliminary findings suggested I had a strong case for at least partial recovery. I thanked them and hung up and sat very still in my home office and looked at the wall for a while. Marcus called on Tuesday. That was 2 days after I had seen the videos, 4 days after he had disappeared. My phone rang and it was his number, and I answered it before I had fully decided to, my body moving faster than my thoughts. He was shouting. That was the first thing I registered, before the words even resolved into meaning. The volume, the pitch, the unmistakable sound of Marcus in distress, which I knew so well, which I had spent so much of my life responding to. He shouted, "What did you do? What did you let her do? Do you know what this is? Do you know what people are saying? I've had strangers showing up at, Renata, there are articles with my name and my face, and you let a 10-year-old. Marcus, I said. Marcus, stop. He stopped, or slowed, breathing audibly. Marcus, I said, did you take my money? A long pause. Renata, did you take $62,000 from my accounts? It's complicated. It's not complicated, I said. My voice was very calm. This surprised me, because I had imagined, during the past 4 days, how I would feel when this call came, and I had imagined rage or grief or some combination that would require careful management. Instead, I felt clear, very simple and very clear. You took money from your sister's accounts. You took money set aside for your niece's education. You did it while sleeping in my house, while eating at my table, while kissing Lily goodnight. There is nothing complicated about what you did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Lower now." The shouting burned off. Deja needed it. She was in a situation she needed money to get out, and I didn't have any. And I knew you had it, and I told myself I would pay it back. You don't pay back $62,000, I said. You don't have $62,000 to pay back. That's not who you are right now, Marcus, and you knew that when you did it. He didn't answer. Where are you? I asked. Silence. Marcus, where are you? Reno, he said finally, quietly. We're in Reno. Turn yourself in, I said. That's what I'm telling you. Turn yourself into the police, cooperate fully, and let the process happen. I can't promise what's going to come next. I can't protect you from the consequences. But I'm telling you as your sister, as the person you stole from, that the only path that has any chance of ending somewhere decent is the one where you don't run anymore. He was breathing. I could hear traffic behind him, and a woman's voice, Deja presumably, saying something I couldn't make out. Renata, he said, I'm so sorry. I know, I said, because I did know. I knew he was sorry in the specific way Marcus was always sorry, which was genuinely and completely, and without it being enough. I need you to do the right thing now, I said. I need you to not run. I hung up. I sat in my office for a long time. Then I went downstairs where Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table, and I sat down across from her and she looked up. Was that Uncle Marcus? She asked. She had heard my voice through the ceiling, apparently, though not the words. Yes, I said. What did he say? He's in Reno. He's sorry. Lily thought about this. Is he going to do the right thing? I looked at my daughter, 10 years old, asking exactly the right question. I think so, I said. I hope so. Me too, she said. She went back to her homework. I watched her for a moment. Then I said, Lily, were you scared when you made those videos? She thought about it. A little, she said. I was scared you'd be upset, and scared it wouldn't work. But you did it anyway. Yeah, she said simply. Because you were on the floor and that wasn't okay, and I thought I could help, and I could. I nodded. She went back to her homework. I thought about what it meant to raise a person who, when faced with the worst thing you could give them, chose action over inaction, chose creative response over helpless waiting, chose to believe that she had something to offer. I thought about whether I had taught her that, and I couldn't be sure. Maybe I had, through years of showing her that problems were solvable, that hard things were survivable, that the answer to difficulty was not surrender. Maybe it was simply who she was. Probably it was both. Marcus did turn himself in. He and Deja drove back to Portland on Thursday, a fact I learned later, not from Marcus, but from a detective who called me that afternoon to tell me that Marcus Calloway had come to the precinct, presented himself voluntarily, and was cooperating with the investigation. He had with him some of the money, less than half of what he had taken, the rest apparently spent in the days between. He was charged. The legal process was what legal processes always are: slow, complicated, full of language that flattened the human reality into procedural categories. I hired a lawyer, I worked with the bank, I answered questions, I filed documents. I was patient in the way you are patient when you have no choice. And when it was all done, when the accounts were rebuilt and the legal process complete, I sat at the kitchen table across from my daughter and watched her do her homework and thought, she will be okay. Not because the world is fair or because people do not betray you, but because she is Lily, because she looks at a problem and asks, with complete certainty, what can I do? And then she does it. I am 38 years old and still learning. She is 10 and already knows,